Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Friends, welcome to the further understanding about rural sociology. And as we have shared earlier with regard to the emergence of rural sociology, that it has emerged in the United States, and also we try to speak about that how we try to track the understanding about the rural sociology in India. I think when we try to speak about that, definitely there are many issues which comes into our mind, that what makes specific about the rural sociology. And as I shared earlier also, that when we try to speak about the Indian society, many things are there which counts with regard to making the Indian society as more unique, especially when we try to speak about what makes India to be different from rest of the world. And one thing that comes in our mind is the caste. So, caste definitely is a crucial variable which makes Indian society to be unique in its own way. And that way, I think most of the sociological studies in India, they did not undermine the recognition of caste as a phenomenon. Similarly, we also have the understanding about the village. So, village also was seen as an important entity when we try to understand that how we can have the specific understanding about the Indian society. So, sometimes it has been said that village are seen as the replica of the Indian society, they are the miniature of the Indian society. So, in that way I think understanding village is understanding India. I think that is how we have tried to understand the relationship between the village and India. And apart from that, I think the question of Hinduism, or maybe the divine kinship, or the kingship networking, I think these are all the other significant things which are quite crucial with regard to the Indian society, but they may not be that unique in terms of its recognition and establishment. So, keeping that background in mind, I think this unit basically will focus upon the village studies in India. I think when we try to say that rural sociology has been established as a discipline with the writings and the contribution and the researches of the specific sociologist, but how they try to understand, what methods they have adopted, what were the perspective that they have approached, or what were the techniques that they have put. I think these are the things which will make the understanding about the rural sociology more focused and more scientific. So, in order to have the scientific and the systematic analysis of the Indian society, and that too of the rural sociology, we have to see that we are basically trying to cover up how the sociologists try to perceive the understanding about the villages in India in their own way. And as we know that different people will have the different way to look to the phenomenon. So, the villages also has been understood and located by the various sociologists in their own way. I think we have the range of perspective which believes on the fact that when we try to speak about that the discipline, if it has to grow, it has to be seen from the multiple angles, and in that way we try to see that the village studies also has to be the prime area of understanding and research, because it will try to give the directionality of how the rural sociology has come to a specific framework. So, we have in this unit of analysis the understanding of village studies in India, and the major concern will be the understanding of the theoretical and the methodological issues. Theoretical and the methodological issues because as I said that if we have to have the systematic understanding of the discipline, I think it requires a specific theory and it requires a specific method. So, both the theory and the methods gives substance to the discipline. So, rural sociology, if we have to understand, it has to be put into a specific theory or it has to be put in a specific method to understand and analyze it in a more systematic way. Now, let us begin with the understanding of the theoretical and the methodological issues in India, and for that the point of focus will be the villages, that how villages has been seen historically across the society, across the state, across the region, or it has been seen across the perspective. So, in either of the way, the so called exploration of the rural becomes important. And as I said earlier also that when we try to speak about the rural, many things which were part and parcel about the rural is that how rural has been visualized. Has it been seen in terms of what one can say the so called what you can say agrarian based society, or we try to see in terms of the specific population or in terms of specific occupation, or we try to see it in terms of the specific state governance. In either of the way, the rural has been projected in a specific fashion which deals with the village. I think one thing which may be coming to your mind, that can we have the exchange understanding or can we have rural and village to be seen as simultaneous, or they are the two different entities, or how we can have an understanding about the rural and how we can have an understanding about the village. I think practically speaking both of them have certain amount of intermingling in terms of an understanding and analysis, but what is more important, to be more categorically correct, is that when we try to speak about the rural, so the rural is to be seen as a phenomenon. So, what rural is, that rural is a specific phenomenon, that is a social phenomenon to understand and analyze, right. So, rural in that sense is what? It is basically seen as a sort of a mental construct. It is basically seen as a mental construct, or we can see it in terms of a specific perception and the cognition. So, the rural incorporates the specific perception, the cognition, or we try to see that what is rural is something which is coming into our mind in terms of an understanding, or we try to see that when we say rural, it speaks about the specific culture or the specific population. Either of the things, these things comes into our mind. But this cognition, if we have to see, basically we try to see it in terms of an abstract, but this abstract has to be seen in terms of clarity or in terms of the concreteness, and there lies the contribution of the village. So, if you try to see rural as a phenomenon, definitely I say that village is a concrete reality. So, this is the rural is an abstract and the village is a reality. I think that is how we see that what village is. The village is definitely an entity which definitely has a physical boundary, and it has a specific occupation which is visible, the agriculture in that sense, and also we try to see the village in terms of what I said reality, in terms of the people which are in the social process, and village which is marked by the various institutions which are having their own dominance or having their own recognition. So, we try to see that the village is a concrete and the rural is a phenomenon. So, in that way we can say that rural is a perception of mind And what village is basically the physical entity, the visible entity, the practical entity which can be seen in terms of a specific setting. So, anything which is a village definitely has a specific location, a specific territory, a specific governance. We can have the categorization of villages also, we can have the different types of villages also. So, these things are there which makes villages in terms of the diversity, in terms of the diversification, but more than that, the village is basically seen as an entity where the complexities and the social interaction between the rural population takes place. Once we have understood what the village is, now let us try to see that how we try to see village in terms of a specific social phenomenon, especially when we try to speak about the village in terms of a sociological analysis. I think that becomes prime for us. So, the village are basically seen as the spatial entities which are to be sociologically explored, and that exploration in a sociological way will lead to a specific way of locating or understanding the villages. Now, if we try to see that these villages, how they have been seen at the different localities or how they have been visualized. So, we try to find out that the village communities are being noticed by the administrators, they are being visualized by the administrators in terms of what? In terms of revenue or in terms of the specific law and order. So, administrators they basically try to see the villages in terms of the revenue or in terms of the law and order, in terms of the so called land reforms or in terms of the development, whatsoever it is, we can have the different ways of looking to the administrative viewpoint of the villages. Then when we try to see it at the academic level, we can have the academic understanding about the village, and in that academic understanding we try to see that how the various internal structures are interacting or how they are in linkage with the other institutions or the other entities, either it is the question of caste or it is the question of kinship or it is the question of marriage or many other things. So, basically we try to see that it is basically leading to certain amount of understanding which has a specific way of looking to the internal structure, and we try to see that the academic way of looking to the village will be more sophisticated, because it will involve a specific perspective, it will involve a specific method to deal with the specific phenomenon. Similarly, we can see that a demographer may have his own way, and what is more important for the demographer is that he will be more interested in the rural population, and this rural population either in terms of the birth rate, in terms of the death rate, or in terms of what you can say the specific understanding of the rural population, either in terms of the male female or in terms of the age or in terms of the specific literacy. In either of the way, the demographer will try to see his own way of looking to the village. Then if you try to see the contribution of an economist basically we try to see it in terms of the economic survey, and their attempt will be definitely to see the so called economy, the rural economy, especially the primary sector, how the primary sector is going to contribute in terms of the GDP or in terms of the per capita income. So, that will be the viewpoint of an economist in terms of an economic survey or in terms of looking to the various ways in which the inflations of the what you can say the crop price or maybe the question of the fertilizers and the other things are going to take place. Now, if we try to see how a political scientist will try to see it, the political scientist will try to see it in terms of the power, and that power which are to be seen either in terms of the devolution of power, especially we try to see the question of the Panchayati Raj, or the rural leadership. So, these are the ways in which a political scientist will try to see the things. Then if you try to see that how the village will be looked by a geographer, and the geographer will definitely try to see in terms of the specific land use pattern, or we try to see that what is the nature of the human settlement, the nature of human settlement. So, that can be another way, or maybe we try to see the spatial distribution or certain other significant component like modern technologies, the mapping in terms of GIS is going to take place for evaluating and analyzing the village. So, I think village has to be seen not as something which is a physical entity, it can have the various what you can say ways which can be what you can say located and which can be seen by the different entities, either the administrators, the academicians, the demographer, the economist, the political scientist, the geographer, and of course, the sociologist, because we are dealing with the sociology. So, definitely we are going to speak about in a broader way how the sociology tries to see the village. Now, first of all, the important thing that becomes crucial for us in terms of analyzing the village is the morphology of the village. The morphology of the village, basically it will try to incorporate the population and the land, which becomes important, because we try to see the range or the population of the houses which are to be seen ranging from 1000 to 5000, depending upon the population, depending upon the size of the village, and accordingly we will try to have the different categorization. We may say that smaller villages which may be called as the hamlets, or we try to see certain other names like patti, or we try to see it in terms of majra, or we have the so called guda. So, there are different terms which can be used for the small entities, the populations which are residing in the rural, and we can have the different terms for that, and then accordingly we can have the various ways in which the villages can be seen in terms of population. We can have the small village, we can have the medium village, and we can have the larger village. So, depending upon the morphology of the village, we can have one way of looking to the village. Then in terms of the social groups and categories, if we try to see social groups and categories. So, in terms of social groups and categories, we try to find out that these social groups and categories may incorporate the question of the family, the question of the caste, the question of the class, the question of the religion, or we may speak about the subcaste. We have the principle of endogamy, or we have the sects, various sects in that sense as such. So, across the section, if you try to see the social groups and the various categories associated with that village are going to be an important issue, which is going to be the important for the understanding of the morphology of the village. Then we can have also what one can say the economic division of the population, and we say that it is the economic division of labor in terms of what is been practiced in the rural areas, that is the Jajmani system. So, the Jajmani system, which is basically the division of labor in terms of the specific occupation by the different categories of people who are specialists in their area in the occupation, and then they try to establish and develop the economy of that particular setting. Now, this is basically how we try to locate the morphology of the village. Then if you try to see village as a moral entity, we try to find out that the village can be seen as a moral entity in terms of a very significant thing, that what we try to call it as a collective sentiment. So, when we say the collective sentiment, basically we try to mean that the village has a prestige associated with the villagers. Then we also try to see that they have the so called collective identity, or sometimes we try to say that they have the specific what you can say community rights associated with the regions, the customary rights. So, these are certain things which makes the collective sentiments, and it is something which is part and parcel of the moral entity. Then we also try to see that the villages are to be seen in terms of the specific celebrations, especially we try to speak about the various festivals and the fairs, I think when we try to speak about the various festivals, the festivals are there which are having a certain amount of uniformity across the nation, but still we try to find out that many villages they have their own unique festivals which are regional, which are local, and they are being celebrated in their own way. And especially if you try to speak about the contribution of Macky Marriott, especially he tries to speak about the various festivals and the fairs which are being seen in the village Kishangadi, and through that only he tries to make the understanding about the universalization and parochialization. Universalization and parochialization. This universalization and parochialization is to be seen with regard to what you can say the village Kishangadi, which has been done by Macky Marriott. So, he tries to see the various festivals and the fairs which are having their uniqueness in terms of an understanding, and apart from that we also try to see the moral entity which are reflected through the various kinship, and this kinship basically it incorporates not only the formal relationships, but it also involves the informal relations. So, like in the formal we may have the two categorization, we may have the so called consanguinal or we have the affinal relationship in terms of the kinship networking, but we have the in the villages we have the informal relations also, which normally we try to associate with the term the fictive kinship. The fictive kinship, that is the villages may have every members are going to be what you can say seen as the brother, the chacha, or we can see them they are being addressed with a specific term, they are in relation to each other as such, and sometimes it is been said that they are treated as the brothers and the sisters in the wider context. So, we try to see that this fictive kinship also prevails in the village, and that is basically seen as not the real what you can say the reality as such, but it is the it is seen as a moral entity of having certain amount of consolidation of their identity and their linkage with the other population. Then we also try to see that the village are to be seen in terms of the specific region, and when we say that village and the region, we try to normally link the village with the idea of the little republic, or we try to see it in terms of what one can say the little community. Little community which has been spoken about by Robert Redfield, and it has been deliberated upon by other scholars in like Professor B. R. Chauhan, and they try to see it in a specific fashion that how the village are to be seen in terms of the specific region. And beyond that, if we try to move further, we try to find out that the region is marked by the specific relations, and here we try to speak about the caste relations which are across the villages, and also the caste relations which are within the villages, and sometimes these relationships goes beyond the purview of that village, and in that way we try to see that there is a larger amount of integration which is visible across the region through these caste or through the religious entities. Then we try to see that village also is being marked by the specific pilgrim center, because most of the villages are having the specific religious locations which are basically seen as the famous sites for worship of the deities, and these worships which are being celebrated by the villagers only, but also it is being celebrated by the urban society. So, the villages are acting as the site of pilgrims. Basically, we try to see that initially in most of the places the pilgrims were in the isolated entities or in the locations which are far flung from the mainstream areas, and gradually we try to see that establishment or the so called habitation of the villages have taken place in and around that place of deity. So, we try to see the village which are to be seen in terms of the pilgrim centers, and we also try to see an interesting thing which is part and parcel of the village, that is we try to see across the villages the notion of the market, which we try to see in terms of hart, or we try to see in terms of bazaar. They may be the weekly markets, or they may be seen as the established markets which are going to, or which are catering to the needs of the local masses as well as the surrounding population. But beyond that, we also try to see that the villages are also to be seen as what I can say the sources of maintaining a certain amount of resilience with regard to the specific what I can say calamities, especially the bigger calamities are being handled by the villagers themselves. And sometimes we try to find out that even when the so called government was unable to cope up with the needs of the people immediately, so the villagers at their own end were trying to what I can say register and control and having certain amount of governance to maintain and manage the immediate remedy of the population which are been facing these crises. So, we try to see that this village which is seen as a homogeneous entity also has certain implications, some positive feelings which tries to make certain amount of disaster management in a very silent way. And also nowadays we try to see that many villages are acting as a site of the various social movements. The clusters of villages which are being projected and reflected as the sites of social movements, especially when we try to speak about the so called Chipko movement, or we try to see the Narmada Bachao Andolan. I think most of the movements have their rooting in the villages, in the so called rural settings, and from there only we try to see that galvanization of or the mobilization of the various movement took place across the nation. And that is how we try to see that villages are not the silent entities, sometimes they can be seen as the voices of the majority, or it can be seen as the mass mobilization which is been registered in the form of the national movement. So, one tries to see that village on the one hand are being seen as the silent entity, on the other hand they are being seen as the roaring entities. So, this amount of reaction which we try to see, on the one hand the silent and on the other hand the roaring makes the village in terms of an entity as the most vibrant entity. So, the village in India definitely are to be seen in a very systematic and in a very academic sense, so that we can have the proper understanding about the village in India. Now, when we try to see how the villages have been seen, especially we try to see that the various studies which took place, I think when we try to have the starting point, B.S. Cohn has rightly emphasized that what are the different ways in which the Indian society has been explored, especially when we try to see the contribution which has tried to focus upon the villages. We try to see that the Indian society, especially the villages, are being seen from the viewpoint of the Orientalist, and then we try to see the contribution from the administrators, and thirdly we try to see the contribution which has come from the missionaries. So, I think these are the different viewpoints for understanding the Indian societies, and the villages are being seen from these perspective. Like when we try to speak about the Orientalist, that is the European trained scholar trying to see the Indian society, the rural, the villages in their own way, that is one way of looking to the villages. Then the so called administrators, especially the British administrators, they were trying to see the villages in their own way, or we try to see the various missionary forces which were trying to have their own mission of what you can say, supporting the population or fighting against the evils or having certain specific objectives. So, they were also trying to understand the various issues which are connected with the villages, either it is the question of the caste, or it is the question of the religion, or is it the question of the untouchability. So, I think many things are being talked about by the missionaries with regard to exploration of the villages in India. So, I think these are certain things which has been spoken about, but the most categorical way of looking to the villages has been significantly and systematically done by the administrators. And especially when we try to speak about, if you can recall that in rural sociology regarding its origin, we have talked about that in India the rural sociology has its emergence with the British administrators trying to have the understanding about the Indian society, and the significant name just for your revision will be Sir Henry Maine, or we have the contribution by Baden Powell, or we try to see the contribution by Charles Metcalfe or many others. So, these peoples have what you can say try to see the Indian society in a specific fashion, either it is in terms of land revenue, or in terms of the kinship relations, or in terms of the economic phenomenon like the land surveys in that sense as such, but they have the specific way of looking to the Indian village. And that we try to say that their understanding, that is the administrator's viewpoint, or maybe sometimes the Orientalist viewpoint, has been seen as that they try to see villages as the closed and the isolated entities. Now, this is their perception that the villages in India, they are to be seen as the closed and the isolated entities, and in that way if you try to see, this gives a notion that the villages are static in nature, they are static in nature, and also they are seen as the atomistic unit which are confined in their own way. But can the village be seen in this fashion alone, or we can have the different viewpoints in which we can have an understanding about the Indian village. So, I think this notion sometimes has created certain amount of resistance from the scholars, because they said that this is the lopsided view, or maybe it tries to put the villages in the darker side and saying that the villages in India are basically the silent and the docile entities. So, it has raised certain criticism from the Indian scholars who try to say that the villages are not to be seen as the very homogeneous categories, they are not to be seen as the closed entities, rather they are to be seen as the heterogeneous entities which has the high amount of mobilization. And when we try to speak about the contribution of Louis Dumont, especially Louis Dumont when he was trying to speak about the official view of caste, he was basically trying to see that the Indian villages, when we try to speak about them, so the Indian villages are to be seen as an entities which are basically trying to what you can say uncover many realities, and we try to see that the villages in India or the Indian society is basically seen as the land of villages. So, the Indian society or India is been marked by the land of villages, and the majority of the population living in the villages happens to be an important issue, and that way we try to see them as the republics in their own way. And when we try to move ahead, we try to see that this village communities which Louis Dumont has mentioned, he was trying to see them into three aspects. One of course is that he tries to see it in terms of a political society, especially when we try to speak about the question of the republic, the village republic as such, and he was also trying to see it as a body of co-owners of the soil, a body of co-owners of the soil. That was another way in which he was trying to see. And the third thing was, it was basically seen as an emblem of what? It was basically seen as an emblem of the traditional economy and polity. And when I say that it is an emblem of traditional economy and polity, I think we also try to see that it was seen as a watchword of patriotism, watchword of patriotism, Indian patriotism. So, because most of our what you can say, the independent movements, I think they have their what you can say ignition basically from the villages. So, we try to see that the high level of patriotism was been visible when we try to speak about the contribution of the villages, and in that way the village in India are seen as what you can say the sites where we have the high level of respect for the nation, of the country in that sense as such, and they try to protect and safeguard the interest of the nation. They also try to have certain amount of institutionalization, regulation of the or even the control on the masses, and that is how we try to see that when we say that the Indian society, the villages are being seen as the autonomous unit, or they were seen as the so called closed entities, but they are not like that. We have to see them across the society, which has to be seen beyond the village identities, which are seen in terms of the solidarity, in terms of the integrity, in terms of the uniqueness as such, and that is how we try to see the understanding about the villages in India. Now, when we try to see significantly how or in what way the sociologists they try to see the villages, because these were certain ways which tries to give a specific image about that this is the village in India. But when we try to see in terms of a specific perspective, especially as I said that the 1950s was the era which marked the beginning of the various studies which took place in India on villages. And I think if you try to rate the contribution of S. C. Dubey, M. N. Srinivas, or we try to see the contribution of D. N. Majumdar, or we try to speak about McKim Marriott, or we try to speak about the contribution of Oscar Lewis. We have a list of people, the scholars, the sociologists who try to see various villages in their own way. Like when S. C. Dubey studied Shamirpet, he was trying to have a different viewpoint for looking to the villages, and M. N. Srinivas studying the village of Rampura, or D. N. Majumdar who was trying to study the village of Mohana near to Lucknow, or we have the study of McKim Marriott on the village Kishangarhi, or we try to see Oscar Lewis in terms of the study of Rampur village. So, we try to see that we had what I can say the villages been explored by the sociologists across the nation, and they were basically seen as the entities which are holistic in nature. They were being seen in terms of what one can say that the villages which are seen in a complete format meaning thereby that they were seen as a complete unit in terms of the holistic understanding about the villages. So, we have the holistic understanding of the villages by these scholars. And when we say holistic studies, I think one thing which we have to confine is that these villages were basically seen in terms of the so called synchronic view. Synchronic view is basically that we try to speak about that the villages were basically being seen as what I can say looking to the villages in a specific time frame in across a specific time. And on the other hand, we also try to see that this synchronic understanding about the village gives a holistic understanding about the village in a detailed way. And when we try to see further understanding, we try to find out that these synchronic studies were seen as the landmark village studies which took place in the Indian society, especially Mackay Marriott's Village India, or we try to speak about S. A. Dubey's India's Indian Village, or M. N. Srinivas India's Villages. I think they were the remarkable work which has been there in 1950s. But as we move towards the 1960s, so the 1960s we try to see a shift, and the shift has basically been from the holistic studies, one village studies, to the multiple villages. And another thing which has happened of course is that the synchronic understanding was been replaced by the diachronic understanding also, that is trying to study the villages across the time. Means we try to see that the villages are to be seen not in a specific time frame, but they are to be seen across the time in the two time frame or in more than two time frame, so that we can have a better understanding about the villages. Now, these studies have given a specific shape to rural sociology, because these were the studies which were not simply confined to studying a single village, but they were trying to give the specific perspective, they were trying to give a meaning to the village, they were trying to establish the scholarship through which the world should know about the reality of the Indian villages. So, these studies sometimes were seen as the landmark studies in the area of village studies in India. Then another person, scholar whose name is considered to be significant is B. R. Chauhan, who basically tries to see the understanding of the village in terms of what you can say, looking to the village from the different ways. At least he tries to say that the village which can be seen in terms of not only the village as an entity, but we can also see that how the village and the important phenomenon of caste can be related to each other. So, we had one way of looking to the village, or one way of looking to the study of villages is that we have one caste and one village. That is one way, that we have one village and one caste, that is one way in which we can approach towards the villages in India in terms of village studies. Then what we can do of course is we can have one village, but we can have multiple caste. We have one village and we can have multiple castes, not focusing upon single caste, but we try to see in a village all the different castes which are prevailing in that particular setting. And then we can speak about, let us say, many village and one caste, that is we try to see a specific caste which can be seen across various villages, like we try to speak about the Brahmins, the Rajputs or the Dalits, that one caste how it has to be seen across different villages. I think that may give a different picture. Or finally, we can say another way of course is that we can have many villages and we can have many caste. So, I think the last one is more complex if you try to see, because it may involve the wider survey, or rather it will try to give a very different picture about looking to the village in India, but and that needs more time. So, basically when we shift from the so called synchrony to the diachrony, synchrony basically involves more time, but diachrony definitely involves more labor, more time, and also it may give a new dimension to locate or understand the villages in India. Then we also try to see that how villages are to be seen in terms of a comparative perspective. In terms of comparative perspective, especially we try to see the comparative perspective which has been used by Mackay Marriott. Mackay Marriott, he tries to study the so called comparative perspective when he was trying to see how the traditions are to be seen across the regions. In that sense, either we try to see in terms of the folk traditions, and we try to see in terms of the folk and the oral traditions, and also we try to see the written tradition. So, the literary traditions, the written traditions and the oral traditions, how we have to see across, that is another way of looking to the specific village. So, we can apply the comparative perspective. Similarly, when we try to see another way of looking to the village, I think the contribution of M. N. Srinivas is going to be important. What M.N. Srinivas speaks about is that when we try to speak about the Indian village, we can see that the Indian village is to be seen in terms of what you can say the field view, because he tried to work upon that how villages are to be seen in the fieldwork situations, or how the fieldwork is going to be more meaningful for understanding the true India, and in that way he was trying to refute the book view notion of the Indian society. So, the book view notion of the Indian society was been rejected by M.N. Srinivas, and he was trying to plea for that the sociologists should go for the field view to have the better understanding about the Indian villages. And for that he was sometimes saying that the book view is basically giving you the what you can say the one sided view. Sometimes he said that the upper caste view is been represented in the name of the book view. So, in order to avoid that, let us try to have the field view, although his contribution also has been criticized, and sometimes his understanding about the Sanskritization, which also has some appeal for the upper caste, but gradually it has been challenged by Edmund Leach, who tried to criticize his contribution on the Sanskritization and dominant caste, which we will try to see and discuss in the later phase. And his study on the Coorg, although that was a landmark study, but it raised lots of criticism in terms of trying to see the specific society and trying to project on the basis of that how the so called Sanskritization across the nation is going to take place, which tries to hegemonize or which tries to have the covering of the unique or uniform culture across the nation. But later on his intensive studies, that is a field viewpoint, has been carried forward by the scholars like Andre Bethe, who had basically studied the Tanjore village, and also we try to see that Andre Bethe's caste, class and power, which was a significant contribution. Similarly, the contribution of A.M. Shah is going to be prime in the field of village studies, and also the contribution of Anand Chakravarti is going to be prime for having the class view of the Indian villages. So, I think these scholars also try to carry forward intensive field work in terms of analyzing and understanding the rural society, but the important thing is that this was giving a new dimension to the understanding about the villages in India. As M.N. Srinivas said that we have to go for observation, and observation through the field work, which requires the drastic time, especially he says that one has to have the 18 months duration for having the participant observation, so that one can understand the whole life cycle of a village. And but definitely it is time consuming, but since he was having the inclination and what you can say the support, and also his guidance from Radcliffe Brown, and was been impressed upon by Malinowski. So, he tried to carry forward the similar things, but these studies also tries to give a different dimension in terms of the structural function perspective. So, the structural functional perspective was basically been talked about by M.N. Srinivas, carrying forward the legacy of people like Radcliffe Brown or Malinowski for that sake as such, and through that they try to understand the Indian villages. Similarly, we try to see another important contribution, that is by Dasgupta, Viplab Dasgupta. Viplab Dasgupta basically he tries to see what? He tries to study 126 villages, and he wanted to have a cross sectional analysis about the various villages, although it was more a survey based analysis which did not encompass the detailed intensive studies, but basically tries to speak about that how what can be the pattern of village setting which is going to be there with regard to the various villages in India. Now, I think S.C. Dubey's contribution happens to be important, because he was also promoter of the structural functional approach. And when we try to see the contribution of S.C. Dubey in terms of the structural functional approach, he was basically trying to speak about the importance of the field work. and in that way he also tried to have certain amount of criticism of the intensive field studies. Especially he says that these field studies which we try to see in terms of the detail, but it cannot give us the diagnostic analysis. So, it cannot be helpful in understanding or analyzing the diagnosing or diagnosing the society in terms of the evil, or we can say that we also try to see that how this can be seen as a biotic community. Biotic community in a sense that we try to see not as a synthetic unit, rather it is simply a biotic community. So, biotic community which is having the so called relationship, but by its own what it is doing, that sometimes the field work tries to fail. And another important thing which we have to see, that they will try to only speak about the continuity and also the sort of what you can say harmony in the society, but what about the changes, what about the so called conflicts which are to take place. So, somewhere he was not very much comfortable with the so called structural functional understanding about the village, and he wanted to see the other perspectives which are going to take place. Now, we also try to see the contribution of Robert Redfield, who was basically trying to speak about the folk urban continuum. So, his approach also was trying to see that how the folk urban continuum can be seen as that the village is not simply restricted to the specific setting, rather it has to be seen in terms of having its linkage with the wider world, especially the urban in that sense as such. So, I think this folk urban continuum was a path breaking way of looking to the society, not as a the village society, not simply as a isolated unit, rather it has to have the relationship with the wider world. And similarly, we try to see people like Robert Redfield, when they were actually speaking about the issue of the folk urban, and later on even in the village India of McKim Marriott, we try to find out that they were trying to see that how we can have the villages which are not to be seen as the representative sample. We should not see them as the representative sample, rather we have to see or we have to capture the diversity of the village. And so, when we actually wanted to have the selection of the villages, I think that representative sample is going to be important, because it depicts not only the that particular village, but it also depicts the Indian reality. So, one has to be particular about that how this so called villages which are to be seen not as an isolated unit, but they are also representing the Indian culture, and that becomes important with regard to the understanding of the Indian society. Then I think if we move ahead, one important name which needs importance is Kathleen Gog, and Kathleen Gog, when the villages been studied by Kathleen Gog, basically the village that was Kumbapete, and in this Kumbapete village, the important thing, that analysis which was going to take place was, it was trying to understand the village in terms of the class viewpoint. The class view is going to be important, because it basically tries to uncover the various complexities which are taking place in the Indian society, especially the villages, because the villages were basically seen in terms of caste, or the caste was going to be an important figure with regard to the analysis of the village in terms of the solidarity, in terms of integrity. But Kathleen Gog was trying to see not only in terms of the class view, but also trying to give a shift from the culture view to the class view, cultural view to the class view. I think that was a important change or a shift which took place, that the cultural view of the village has to be replaced by the class view, because that will give you the diachronic understanding about the Indian villages. So, this is again significant contribution by Kathleen Gog to understand the class view of the Indian society. And then we also try to see the contribution of B.S. Cohen. Now, B.S. Cohen was basically trying to see the caste in terms of the complexities, especially we try to see how he was trying to focus upon the specific community. He was trying to pinpoint the studies on the Chamars, how the mobility among the Chamar community takes place basically in the Madhopur village in UP, and we try to see that these depressed caste, how they can be seen as not the docile masses, rather they also have the amount of mobility which has been talked about by B.S. Cohen in the intensive work. And we also try to see that Oscar Lewis was trying to understand the society in the comparative analysis. So, the analysis which was been going with regard to the relationship of villages in India and also the villages in Mexico. So, Oscar Lewis was basically trying to have a comparative analysis of the village life in India and in Mexico, and in that way I think if you try to see the village which has been spoken about in India, of course, is trying to speak about the village of Ranikhera, and the Mexican village, I think the famous work which we try to see is the contribution of Tepoztlan village, which was going to be significant, because it tries to give a new dimension to the understanding about the village studies in India, a comparison across the nation, a comparison across the region that has been significantly carried forward by the Oscar Lewis with regard to the Tepoztlan village, which is going to be significant contribution. And I think when we try to speak about the whole notion or the whole questions which has been raised is that whether we try to see village as a community or we try to see it beyond that, means can we have the limits of villages beyond the boundaries, or if we try to see can we have other dimensions of looking to the village. So, I think a village should not be confined to a specific region, a closed boundaries, but rather we have to see that it has to be seen beyond those boundaries, and that can be the better analysis of the villages in India. And I think that way if you try to see, I think Mackie-Marriott also has tried to discuss upon the village as a small world, which of course is a unit of not only the Indian society, but also it is a cosmos of the whole of the world. And I think the important things which have been raised is that we try to see that the village is the representation of the Indian civilization. So, the village representing the Indian civilization, that is going to be important as such, and we try to see that how much village is going to bring about the significant changes in the understanding about the villages in India. And finally, if we try to see, we try to find out the contribution that we have, especially D. N. Majumdar's contribution on caste and communication in India. I think that is going to be significant, because it tries to speak about the cultural dimension of the villages in India, and we try to see in a nutshell that what is the nature of social change which is happening in the village, that is going to be important. Then what areas of the villages are undergoing changes, that also has to be studied through these village studies. The third bigger question which we have to see is that what is the content of the what you can say and the goal of such changes, means in which direction we try to move ahead in that sense. And we also have to locate that what are the various channels through which the changes are coming up. And finally, we also have to see that what are the intrinsic and the extrinsic forces of change. I think these are certain things which are part and parcel about looking to the studies on villages in India, either it is the era of 1950s, 1960s and 70s. Now, we are into the global era, where we try to see that villages are not to be seen in terms of the Indian civilization, rather we have to see that how they are connected with the outside world, in a sense internationally also how they are connected. Like we try to speak about the diaspora, we try to speak about the villages in terms of e-villages, we try to see e-panchayats, or we try to speak about the notion of the e-governance, and all these things are basically coming and trying to what you can say have a new way of looking to the villages in India. And in that way, I think now the gamut of researches, even the theories which are to be applied, or maybe the methodologies which are to be applied, are to be across the discipline. Because now we try to see, a political scientist trying to see the village in a different way, or the so called economist is trying to see the village in a different way. So, I think now we try to have the interdisciplinary understanding about the villages, which is going to be the new trend which is coming up. And I think these are the ways in which we can have the wider way of looking at the things. We should not see village studies simply as the problem solving entities, rather we have to see that how these empirical findings will lead to the new facts and to build up the new theories, and which should not be applied and restricted to the Indian society, rather it should have its implication across the world, and that is where lies the strength of the village studies. So, we have to sharpen our what you can say methodologies, we have to sharpen our observations, so that we can trap the realities, the changes, the mobility which are taking place, and it can give a new direction to the understanding about the villages. So, I think it is not the question of the intra village, the intra villages across the regions are to be seen in a well knit fashion, and that is how we try to see that village studies needs new directions. So, I think friends, these are the ways to analyze the village studies, and with that let us sum up the things which we have discussed, the various scholars, the perspective, the methods that we have used, and this is going to give the right directionality to the understanding about the villages in India. And with that, I think further chapters will be dealing with different aspects, the changes and other major significant works in the field of villages in India. Thank you.